action as necessary against the communists. Part of it seems to have been a feeling that he was unjustly singled out in a war with many similar atrocities. Colonel Orrin Henderson, who had been charged with covering up the My Lai killings, told reporters in early 1971, "Every unit of brigade size has its My Lai hidden someplace." Indeed, My Lai was unique only in its details. Hirsch reported a letter sent by a GI to his family and published in a local newspaper. "Dear Mom and Dad, today we went on a mission, and I am not very proud of myself, my friends, or my country. We burned every hut in sight. It was a small, rural network of villages, and the people were incredibly poor. My unit burned and plundered their meager possessions. Let me try to explain the situation to you. The huts here are thatched palm leaves. Each one has a dried mud bunker inside. These bunkers are to protect the families, kind of like air raid shelters. My unit commanders, however, chose to think that these bunkers are offensive. So every hut we find that has a bunker, we are ordered to burn to the ground. When the 10 helicopters landed this morning in the midst of these huts, and 6 men jumped out of each chopper, we were firing the moment we hit the ground. We fired into all the huts we could. It is then that we burned these huts. Everyone is crying, begging, and praying that we don't separate them and take their husbands and fathers, sons and grandfathers. The women wail and moan. Then they watch in terror as we burn their homes, personal possessions, and food. Yes, we burn all rice and shoot all livestock." The more unpopular became the Saigon government, the more desperate the military effort became to make up for this. A secret congressional report of late 1967 said the Viet Cong were distributing about 5 times more land to the peasants than the South Vietnamese government, whose land distribution program had come to a virtual standstill. The report said, "The Viet Cong have eliminated landlord domination and reallocated lands owned by absentee landlords and the GVN, government of Vietnam, to the landless and others who cooperate with Viet Cong authorities." The unpopularity of the Saigon government explains the success of the National Liberation Front in infiltrating Saigon and other government-held towns in early 1968, without the people there warning the government. The NLF thus launched a surprise offensive. It was the time of Tet, their New Year holiday, that carried them into the heart of Saigon, immobilized Tan Son Nhut airfield, even occupied the American embassy briefly. The offensive was beaten back, but it demonstrated that all the enormous firepower delivered in Vietnam by the United States had not destroyed the NLF, its morale, its popular support, its will to fight. It caused a reassessment in the American government, more doubts among the American people. The massacre at My Lai by a company of ordinary soldiers was a small event compared with the plans of high-level military and civilian leaders to visit massive destruction on the civilian population of Vietnam. Assistant Secretary of Defense John McNaughton, in early 1966, seeing that large-scale bombing of North Vietnam villages was not producing the desired result, suggested a different strategy. The airstrikes on villages, he said, would create a counterproductive wave of revulsion abroad and at home. He suggested instead, destruction of locks and dams, however, if handled right, might offer promise. It should be studied. Such destruction doesn't kill or drown people. By shallow flooding the rice, it leads after a time to widespread starvation, more than 1 million, unless food is provided, which we could offer to do at the conference table. The heavy bombings were intended to destroy the will of ordinary Vietnamese to resist, as in the bombings of German and Japanese population centers in World War II, despite President Johnson's public insistence that only military targets were being bombed. The government was using language like, "one more turn of the screw," to describe bombing. The CIA at one point in 1966 recommended a bombing program of greater intensity, according to the Pentagon Papers, directed against, in the CIA's words, the will of the regime as a target system. Meanwhile, just across the border of Vietnam, in a neighboring country, Laos, where a right-wing government installed by the CIA faced a rebellion, One of the most beautiful areas in the world, the Plain of Jars, was being destroyed by bombing. This was not reported by the government or the press, but an American who lived in Laos, Fred Branfman, told the story in his book, Voices from the Plain of Jars. Over 25,000 attack sorties were flown against the Plain of Jars from May 1964 through September 1969. Over 75,000 tons of bombs were dropped on it. On the ground, thousands were killed and wounded, tens of thousands driven underground, and the entire above-ground society leveled. Branfman, who spoke the Laotian language and lived in a village with a Laotian family, interviewed hundreds of refugees from the bombing who poured into the capital city of Vientiane. He recorded their statements and preserved their drawings. A 26-year-old nurse from Xianqiang told of her life in the village. I was at one with the earth, the air, the upland fields, the paddy and the seedbeds of my village. Each day and night in the light of the moon, I and my friends from the village would wander, calling out and singing through forest and field amidst the cries of the birds. During the harvesting and planting season, we would sweat and labor together under the sun and the rain, contending with poverty and miserable conditions, continuing the farmer's life which has been the profession of our ancestors. But in 1964 and 1965, I could feel the trembling of the earth and the shock from the sounds of arms exploding around my village. I began to hear the noise of airplanes circling about in the heavens. One of them would stick its head down and, plunging earthward, loose a loud roar, shocking the earth as light and smoke covered everything so that one could not see anything at all. Each day we would exchange news with the neighboring villagers of the bombings that had occurred, the damaged houses, the injured and the dead. The holes, the holes. During that time we needed holes to save our lives. We who were young took our sweat and our strength, which should have been spent raising food in the rice fields and forests, to sustain our lives, and squandered it digging holes to protect ourselves. One young woman explained why the revolutionary movement in Laos, the Neo-Lao, attracted her and so many of her friends. As a young girl, I had found that the past had not been very good, for men had mistreated and made fun of women as the weaker sex. But after the Neo-Lao party began to administer the region, it became very different. Under the Neo-Lao, things changed psychologically, such as their teaching that women should be as brave as men. For example, although I had gone to school before, my elders advised me not to. They had said that it would not be useful for me as I could not hope to be a high-ranking official after graduation, that only the children of the elite or rich could expect that. But the Neo-Lao said that the women should have the same education as men, and they gave us equal privileges and did not allow anyone to make fun of us. And the old associations were changed into new ones. For example, most of the new teachers and doctors trained were women, and they changed the lives of the very poor, for they shared the land of those who had many rice fields with those who had none. A 17-year-old boy told about the Pathet Lao Revolutionary Army coming to his village. Some people were afraid, mostly those with money. They offered cows to the Pathet Lao soldiers to eat, but the soldiers refused to take them. If they did take them, they paid a suitable price. The truth is that they led the people not to be afraid of anything. Then they organized the election of village and canton chief, and the people were the ones who chose them. Desperation led the CIA to enlist the Hmong tribesmen in military campaigns, which led to the deaths of thousands of Hmong. This was accompanied by secrecy and lying, as was so much of what happened in Laos. In September 1973, a former government official in Laos, Jerome Doolittle, wrote in the New York Times, "The Pentagon's most recent lies about bombing Cambodia bring back a question that often occurred to me when I was press attaché at the American Embassy in Vientiane, Laos. Why did we bother to lie? When I first arrived in Laos, I was instructed to answer all press questions about our massive and merciless bombing campaign in that tiny country with, at the request of the Royal Laotian government, the United States is conducting unarmed reconnaissance flights accompanied by armed escorts who have the right to return if fired upon." This was a lie. Every reporter to whom I told it knew it was a lie. Hanoi knew it was a lie. The International Control Commission knew it was a lie. Every interested congressman and newspaper reader knew it was a lie. After all, the lies did serve to keep something from somebody, and the somebody was us. By early 1968, the cruelty of the war began touching the conscience of many Americans. For many others, the problem was that the United States was unable to win the war, while 40,000 American soldiers were dead by this time, 250,000 wounded, with no end in sight. The Vietnam casualties were many times this number. Lyndon Johnson had escalated a brutal war and failed to win it. His popularity was at an all-time low. He could not appear publicly without a demonstration against him in the war. The chant, LBJ, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today, was heard in demonstrations throughout the country. In the spring of 1968, Johnson announced he would not run again for president, and that negotiations for peace would begin with the Vietnamese in Paris. In the fall of 1968, Richard Nixon, pledging that he would get the United States out of Vietnam, was elected president. He began to withdraw troops. By February 1972, less than 150,000 were left. But the bombing continued. Nixon's policy was Vietnamization. The Saigon government, with Vietnamese ground troops, using American money and air power, would carry on the war. Nixon was not ending the war. He was ending the most unpopular aspect of it, the involvement of American soldiers on the soil of a faraway country. In the spring of 1970, Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger launched an invasion of Cambodia, after a long bombardment that the government never disclosed to the public. The invasion not only led to an outcry of protest in the United States, it was a military failure, and Congress resolved that Nixon could not use American troops in extending the war without congressional approval. The following year, without American troops, the United States supported a South Vietnamese invasion of Laos. This too failed. In 1971, 800,000 tons of bombs were dropped by the United States on Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. Meantime, the Saigon military regime, headed by President Nguyen Van Thieu, the last of a long succession of Saigon chiefs of state, was keeping thousands of opponents in jail. Some of the first signs of opposition in the United States to the Vietnam War came out of the civil rights movement, perhaps because the experience of black people with the government led them to distrust any claim that it was fighting for freedom. On the very day that Lyndon Johnson was telling the nation in early August 1964 about the Gulf of Tonkin incident and announcing the bombing of North Vietnam, black and white activists were gathering near Philadelphia, Mississippi, at a memorial service for the 3 civil rights workers killed there that summer. One of the speakers pointed bitterly to Johnson's use of force in Asia, comparing it with the violence used against blacks in Mississippi. In mid-1965, in Macomb, Mississippi, young blacks who had just learned that a classmate of theirs was killed in Vietnam distributed a leaflet. No Mississippi Negroes should be fighting in Vietnam for the white man's freedom until all the Negro people are free in Mississippi. Negro boys should not honor the draft here in Mississippi. Mothers should encourage their sons not to go. No one has a right to ask us to risk our lives and kill other colored people in Santo Domingo and Vietnam so that the white American can get richer. When Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara visited Mississippi and praised Senator John Stennis, a prominent racist, as a man of genuine greatness, white and black students marched in protest with placards saying, "In memory of the burned children of Vietnam." The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee declared in early 1966 that the United States is pursuing an aggressive policy in violation of international law and called for withdrawal from Vietnam. That summer, 6 members of SNCC were arrested for an invasion of an induction center in Atlanta. They were convicted and sentenced to several years in prison. Around the same time, Julian Bond, a SNCC activist who had just been elected to the Georgia House of Representatives, spoke out against the war and the draft, and the House voted that he not be seated because his statements violated the Selective Service Act and tend to bring discredit to the House. The Supreme Court restored Bond to his seat, saying he had the right to free expression under the First Amendment. One of the great sports figures of the nation, Muhammad Ali, the black boxer and heavyweight champion, refused to serve in what he called a white man's war. Boxing authorities took away his title as champion. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out in 1967 at Riverside Church in New York. Somehow this madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as a child of God and brother to the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for those whose land is being laid waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted. I speak for the poor of America who are paying the double price of smashed hopes at home and death and corruption in Vietnam. I speak as a citizen of the world, for the world as it stands aghast at the path we have taken. I speak as an American to the leaders of my own nation. The great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours. Young men began to refuse to register for the draft, refuse to be inducted if called. As early as May 1964, the slogan, "We won't go," was widely publicized. Some who had registered began publicly burning their draft cards to protest the war. One, David O'Brien, burned his draft card in South Boston. He was convicted, and the Supreme Court overruled his argument that this was a protected form of free expression. In October of 1967, there were organized draft card turn-ins all over the country. In San Francisco alone, 300 draft cards were returned to the government. Just before a huge demonstration at the Pentagon that month, a sack of collected draft cards was presented to the Justice Department. By mid-1965, 380 prosecutions were begun against men refusing to be inducted. By mid-1968, that figure was up to 3,305. At the end of 1969, there were 33,960 delinquents nationwide. In May 1969, the Oakland Induction Center, where draftees reported from all of Northern California, reported that of 4,400 men ordered to report for induction, 2,400 did not show up. In the first quarter of 1970, the Selective Service System, for the first time, could not meet its quota. A Boston University graduate student in history, Philip Supina, wrote on May 1, 1968, to his draft board in Tucson, Arizona. I am enclosing the order for me to report for my pre-induction physical exam for the armed forces. I have absolutely no intention to report for that exam, or for induction, or to aid in any way the American war effort against the people of Vietnam. He ended his letter by quoting the Spanish philosopher Miguel Unamuno, who during the Spanish Civil War said, "Sometimes to be silent is to lie." Supina was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison. Early in the war, there had been 2 separate incidents barely noticed by most Americans. On November 2, 1965, in front of the Pentagon in Washington, as thousands of employees were streaming out of the building in the late afternoon, Norman Morrison, a 32-year-old pacifist, father of 3, stood below the third-floor windows of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, doused himself with kerosene, and set himself afire, giving up his life in protest against the war. Also that year in Detroit, an 82-year-old woman named Alice Hertz burned herself to death to make a statement against the horror of Indochina. A remarkable change in sentiment took place. In early 1965, when the bombing of North Vietnam began, 100 people gathered on the Boston Common to voice their indignation. On October 15, 1969, the number of people assembled on the Boston Common to protest the war was 100,000. Perhaps 2 million people across the nation gathered that day in towns and villages that had never seen an anti-war meeting. In the summer of 1965, a few hundred people had gathered in Washington to march in protest against the war. The first in line, historian Stoughton Lynd, SNCC organizer Bob Moses, and longtime pacifist David Dellinger were splattered with red paint by hecklers. But by 1970, the Washington peace rallies were drawing hundreds of thousands of people. In 1971, 20,000 came to Washington to commit civil disobedience, trying to tie up Washington traffic to express their revulsion against the killings still going on in Vietnam. 14,000 of them were arrested, the largest mass arrest in American history. Hundreds of volunteers in the Peace Corps spoke out against the war. In Chile, 92 volunteers defied the Peace Corps director and issued a circular denouncing the war. 800 former members of the Corps issued a statement of protest against what was happening in Vietnam. The poet Robert Lowell, invited to a White House function, refused to come. Arthur Miller, also invited, sent a telegram to the White House. When the guns boom, the arts die. Singer Eartha Kitt was invited to a luncheon on the White House lawn and shocked all those present by speaking out in the presence of the president's wife against the war. A teenager called to the White House to accept a prize came and criticized the war. In Hollywood, local artists erected a 60-foot tower of protest on Sunset Boulevard. At the National Book Award ceremonies in New York, 50 authors and publishers walked out on a speech by Vice President Humphrey in a display of anger at his role in the war. In London, 2 young Americans gatecrashed the American ambassador's elegant 4th of July reception and called out a toast. To all the dead and dying in Vietnam. They were carried out by guards. In the Pacific Ocean, 2 young American seamen hijacked an American munitions ship to divert its load of bombs from air bases in Thailand. For 4 days, they took command of the ship and its crew, taking amphetamine pills to stay awake, until the ship reached Cambodian waters. The Associated Press reported in late 1972 from York, Pennsylvania. 5 anti-war activists were arrested by the state police today for allegedly sabotaging railroad equipment near a factory that makes bomb casings used in the Vietnam War. Middle-class and professional people, unaccustomed to activism, began to speak up. In May 1970, the New York Times reported from Washington, 1,000 establishment lawyers joined war protest. Corporations began to wonder whether the war was going to hurt their long-range business interests. The Wall Street Journal began criticizing the continuation of the war. As the war became more and more unpopular, people in or close to the government began to break out of the circle of assent. The most dramatic instance was the case of Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg was a Harvard-trained economist, a former Marine officer employed by the Rand Corporation, which did special, often secret research for the U.S. government. Ellsberg helped write the Department of Defense history of the war in Vietnam, and then decided to make the top-secret document public with the aid of his friend, Anthony Russo, a former Rand Corporation man. The two had met in Saigon, where both had been affected in different experiences by direct sight of the war, and had become powerfully indignant at what the United States was doing to the people of Vietnam. Ellsberg and Russo spent night after night, after hours, at a friend's advertising agency, duplicating the 7,000-page document. Then Ellsberg gave copies to various congressmen and to the New York Times. In June 1971, the Times began printing selections from what came to be known as the Pentagon Papers. It created a national sensation. The Nixon administration tried to get the Supreme Court to stop further publication, but the court said that this was prior restraint of the freedom of the press and thus unconstitutional. The government then indicted Ellsberg and Russo for violating the Espionage Act by releasing classified documents to unauthorized people. They faced long terms in prison if convicted. The judge, however, called off the trial during the jury deliberations because the Watergate events unfolding at the time revealed unfair practices by the prosecution. Ellsberg, by his bold act, had broken with the usual tactic of dissidents inside the government who bided their time and kept their opinions to themselves, hoping for small changes in policy. A colleague urged him not to leave the government because there he had access, saying, "Don't cut yourself off. Don't cut your throat." Ellsberg replied, "Life exists outside the executive branch." The anti-war movement, early in its growth, found a strange new constituency, priests and nuns of the Catholic Church. Some of them had been aroused by the civil rights movement. others by their experiences in Latin America, where they saw poverty and injustice under governments supported by the United States. In the fall of 1967, Father Philip Berrigan, a Josephite priest who was a veteran of World War II, joined by artists Tom Lewis and friends David Eberhardt and James Mengel, went to the office of a draft board in Baltimore, Maryland, drenched the draft records with blood, and waited to be arrested. They were put on trial and sentenced to prison terms of 2 to 6 years. The following May, Philip Berrigan, out on bail in the Baltimore case, was joined in a second action by his brother Daniel, a Jesuit priest who had visited North Vietnam and seen the effects of U.S. bombing. They and 7 other people went into a draft board office in Catonsville, Maryland, removed records, and set them afire outside in the presence of reporters and onlookers. They were convicted and sentenced to prison and became famous as the Catonsville Nine. Dan Berrigan wrote a meditation at the time of the Catonsville incident. Our apologies, good friends, for the fracture of good order, the burning of paper instead of children, the angering of the orderlies in the front parlor of the charnel house. We could not, so help us God, do otherwise. We say killing is disorder. Life and gentleness and community and unselfishness is the only order we recognize. For the sake of that order, we risk our liberty, our good name. The time is past when good men can remain silent, when obedience can segregate men from public risk, when the poor can die without defense. When his appeals had been exhausted and he was supposed to go to prison, Daniel Berrigan disappeared. While the FBI searched for him, he showed up at an Easter festival at Cornell University, where he had been teaching. With dozens of FBI men looking for him in the crowd, he suddenly appeared on stage. Then the lights went out. He hid inside a giant figure of the Bread and Puppet Theater, which was on stage, was carried out to a truck, and escaped to a nearby farmhouse. He stayed underground for 4 months, writing poems, issuing statements, giving secret interviews, appearing suddenly in a Philadelphia church to give a sermon, and then disappearing again, baffling the FBI, until an informer's interception of a letter disclosed his whereabouts, and he was captured and imprisoned. The one woman among the Catonsville Nine, Mary Moylan, a former nun, also refused to surrender to the FBI. She was never found. Writing from underground, she reflected on her experience and how she came to it. We had all known we were going to jail, so we all had our toothbrushes. I was just exhausted. I took my little box of clothes and stuck it under the cot and climbed into bed. Now all the women in the Baltimore County Jail were black. I think there was only one white. The women were waking me up and saying, "Aren't you going to cry?" I said, "What about?" They said, "You're in jail." And I said, "Yeah, I knew I'd be here." I was sleeping between 2 of these women, and every morning I'd wake up and they'd be leaning on their elbows watching me. They'd say, "You slept all night," and they couldn't believe it. They were good. We had a good time. I suppose the political turning point in my life came while I was in Uganda. I was there when American planes were bombing the Congo, and we were very close to the Congo border. The planes came over and bombed 2 villages in Uganda. Where the hell did the American planes come in? Later I was in Dar es Salaam, and Chow En Lai came to town. The American embassy sent out letters saying that no Americans were to be on the street because this was a dirty communist leader. But I decided this was a man who was making history, and I wanted to see him. When I came home from Africa, I moved to Washington and had to deal with the scene there and the insanity and brutality of the cops and the type of life that was led by most of the citizens of that city, 70% black. And then Vietnam and the napalm and the defoliants and the bombings. I got involved with the women's movement about a year ago. At the time of Catonsville, going to jail made sense to me, partially because of the black scene. So many blacks forever filling the jails. I don't think it's a valid tactic anymore. I don't want to see people marching off to jail with smiles on their faces. I just don't want them going. The 70s are going to be very difficult, and I don't want to waste the sisters and brothers we have by marching them off to jail and having mystical experiences or whatever they're going to have. The effect of the war and of the bold action of some priests and nuns was to crack the traditional conservatism of the Catholic community. On Moratorium Day 1969, at the Newton College of the Sacred Heart near Boston, a sanctuary of bucolic quiet and political silence, the great front door of the college displayed a huge painted red fist. At Boston College, a Catholic institution, 6,000 people gathered that evening in the gymnasium to denounce the war. Students were heavily involved in the early protests against the war. A survey by the Urban Research Corporation for the first 6 months of 1969 only, and for only 232 of the nation's 2,000 institutions of higher education, showed that at least 215,000 students had participated in campus protests, that 3,652 had been arrested, that 956 had been suspended or expelled. Even in the high schools in the late 60s, there were 500 underground newspapers. At the Brown University commencement in 1969, 2/3 of the graduating class turned their backs when Henry Kissinger stood up to address them. The climax of protest came in the spring of 1970, when President Nixon ordered the invasion of Cambodia. At Kent State University in Ohio, on May 4th, when students gathered to demonstrate against the war, National Guardsmen fired into the crowd. 4 students were killed. 1 was paralyzed for life. Students at 400 colleges and universities went on strike in protest. It was the first general student strike in the history of the United States. During that school year of 1969 to 1970, the FBI listed 1,785 student demonstrations, including the occupation of 313 buildings. The commencement day ceremonies after the Kent State killings were unlike any the nation had ever seen. From Amherst, Massachusetts, came this newspaper report. The 100th commencement of the University of Massachusetts yesterday was a protest, a call for peace. The roll of the funeral drum set the beat for 2,600 young men and women marching, in fear, in despair, and in frustration. Red fists of protest, white peace symbols, and blue doves were stenciled on black academic gowns, and nearly every other senior wore an armband representing a plea for peace. Student protests against the ROTC, Reserve Officers Training Program, resulted in the canceling of those programs in over 40 colleges and universities. In 1966, 191,749 college students enrolled in ROTC. By 1973, the number was 72,459. The ROTC was depended on to supply half the officers in Vietnam. In September 1973, for the 6th straight month, the ROTC could not fulfill its quota. One Army official said, "I just hope we don't get into another war, because if we do, I doubt we could fight it." The publicity given to the student protests created the impression that the opposition to the war came mostly from middle-class intellectuals. When some construction workers in New York attacked student demonstrators, the news was played up in the national media. However, a number of elections in American cities, including those where mostly blue-collar workers lived, showed that anti-war sentiment was strong in the working classes. For instance, in Dearborn, Michigan, an automobile manufacturing town, a poll as early as 1967 showed 41% of the population favored withdrawal from the Vietnam War. In 1970, in 2 counties in California where petitioners placed the issue on the ballot, San Francisco County and Marin County, referenda asking withdrawal of the U.S. forces from Vietnam received a majority vote. In late 1970, when a Gallup poll presented the statement, "The United States should withdraw all troops from Vietnam by the end of next year," 65% of those questioned said yes. In Madison, Wisconsin, in the spring of 1971, a resolution calling for an immediate withdrawal of U.S. forces from Southeast Asia won by 31,000 to 16,000. In 1968, such a resolution had lost. But the most surprising data were in a survey made by the University of Michigan. This showed that throughout the Vietnam War, Americans with only a grade school education were much stronger for withdrawal from the war than Americans with a college education. In June 1966, of people with a college education, 27% were for immediate withdrawal from Vietnam. Of people with only a grade school education, 41% were for immediate withdrawal. By September 1970, both groups were more anti-war. 47% of the college-educated were for withdrawal, and 61% of grade school graduates. There is more evidence of the same kind. In an article in American Sociological Review, June 1968, Richard F. Hamilton found in his survey of public opinion, preferences for tough policy alternatives are most frequent among the following groups: the highly educated, high-status occupations, those with high incomes, younger persons, and those paying much attention to newspapers and magazines. And a political scientist, Harlan Hahn, doing a study of various city referenda on Vietnam, found support for withdrawal from Vietnam highest in groups of lower socioeconomic status. He also found that the regular polls, based on samplings, underestimated the opposition to the war among lower-class people. All this was part of a general change in the entire population of the country. In August of 1965, 61% of the population thought the American involvement in Vietnam was not wrong. By May 1971, it was exactly reversed. 61% thought our involvement was wrong. Bruce Andrews, a Harvard student of public opinion, found that the people most opposed to the war were people over 50, blacks and women. He also noted that a study in the spring of 1964, when Vietnam was a minor issue in the newspapers, showed that 53% of college-educated people were willing to send troops to Vietnam, but only 33% of grade school-educated people were so willing. It seems that the media, themselves controlled by higher education, higher income people who were more aggressive in foreign policy, tended to give the erroneous impression that working-class people were super patriots for the war. Louis Leipzitz, in a mid-1968 survey of poor blacks and whites in the South, paraphrased an attitude he found typical. The only way to help the poor man is to get out of that war in Vietnam. These taxes, high taxes, it's going over yonder to kill people with, and I don't see no cause in it. The capacity for independent judgment among ordinary Americans is probably best shown by the swift development of anti-war feeling among American GIs, volunteers and draftees, who came mostly from lower-income groups. There had been earlier in American history instances of soldiers' disaffection from the war, isolated mutinies in the Revolutionary War, refusal of re-enlistment in the midst of hostilities in the Mexican War, desertion and conscientious objection in World War I and World War II. But Vietnam produced opposition by soldiers and veterans on a scale and with a fervor never seen before. It began with isolated protests. As early as June 1965, Richard Steinke, a West Point graduate in Vietnam, refused to board an aircraft taking him to a remote Vietnamese village. The Vietnamese War, he said, is not worth a single American life. Steinke was court-martialed and dismissed from the service. The following year, 3 Army privates, 1 black, 1 Puerto Rican, 1 Lithuanian Italian, all poor, refused to embark for Vietnam, denouncing the war as immoral, illegal, and unjust. They were court-martialed and imprisoned. In early 1967, Captain Howard Levy, an Army doctor at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, refused to teach Green Berets, a special forces elite in the military. He said they were murderers of women and children and killers of peasants. He was court-martialed on the grounds that he was trying to promote disaffection among enlisted men by his statements. The colonel who presided at the trial said, "The truth of the statements is not an issue in this case." Levy was convicted and sentenced to prison. The individual acts multiplied. A black private in Oakland refused to board a troop plane to Vietnam, although he faced 11 years at hard labor. A Navy nurse, Lieutenant Susan Schnall, was court-martialed for marching in a peace demonstration while in uniform, and for dropping anti-war leaflets from a plane on Navy installations. In Norfolk, Virginia, a sailor refused to train fighter pilots because he said the war was immoral. An Army lieutenant was arrested in Washington, D.C. in early 1968 for picketing the White House with a sign that said, 120,000 American casualties. Why? Two black Marines, George Daniels and William Harvey, were given long prison sentences, Daniels 6 years, Harvey 10 years, both later reduced, for talking to other black Marines against the war. As the war went on, desertions from the armed forces mounted. Thousands went to Western Europe, France, Sweden, Holland. Most deserters crossed into Canada. Some estimates were 50,000, others 100,000. Some stayed in the United States. A few openly defied the military authorities by taking sanctuary in churches, where, surrounded by anti-war friends and sympathizers, they waited for capture and court-martial. At Boston University, 1,000 students kept vigil for 5 days and nights in the chapel, supporting an 18-year-old deserter, Ray Kroll. Kroll's story was a common one. He had been inveigled into joining the army. He came from a poor family, was brought into court, charged with drunkenness, and given the choice of prison or enlistment. He enlisted, and then he began to think about the nature of the war. On a Sunday morning, federal agents showed up at the Boston University chapel, stomped their way through aisles clogged with students, smashed down doors, and took Kroll away. From the stockade, he wrote back to friends, "I ain't gonna kill, it's against my will." A friend he had made at the chapel brought him books, and he noted saying he had found in one of them, "What we have done will not be lost to all eternity. Everything ripens at its time and becomes fruit at its hour." The GI anti-war movement became more organized. Near Fort Jackson, South Carolina, the first GI coffee house was set up, a place where soldiers could get coffee and donuts, find anti-war literature, and talk freely with others. It was called the UFO and lasted for several years before it was declared a public nuisance and closed by court action. But other GI coffee houses sprang up in half a dozen other places across the country. An anti-war bookstore was opened near Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and another one at the Newport, Rhode Island Naval Base. Underground newspapers sprang up at military bases across the country. By 1970, more than 50 were circulating. Among them, About Face in Los Angeles, Fed Up in Tacoma, Washington, Short Times at Fort Jackson, Vietnam GI in Chicago, Graffiti in Heidelberg, Germany, Bragg Briefs in North Carolina, Last Harass at Fort Gordon, Georgia, Helping Hand at Mountain Home Air Base, Idaho. These newspapers printed anti-war articles, gave news about the harassment of GIs and practical advice on the legal rights of servicemen, told how to resist military domination. Mixed with feeling against the war was resentment at the cruelty, the dehumanization of military life. In the army prisons, the stockades, this was especially true. In 1968, at the Presidio Stockade in California, a guard shot to death an emotionally disturbed prisoner for walking away from a work detail. 27 prisoners then sat down and refused to work, singing, "We Shall Overcome." They were court-martialed, found guilty of mutiny, and sentenced to terms of up to 14 years, later reduced after much public attention and protest. The dissidents spread to the war front itself. When the Great Moratorium Day demonstrations were taking place in October 1969 in the United States, some GIs in Vietnam wore black armbands to show their support. A news photographer reported that in a platoon on patrol near Da Nang, about half of the men were wearing black armbands. One soldier stationed at Cu Chi wrote to a friend on October 26, 1970, that separate companies had been set up for men refusing to go into the field to fight. It's no big thing here anymore to refuse to go. The French newspaper Le Monde reported that in 4 months, 109 soldiers of the 1st Air Cavalry Division were charged with refusal to fight. A common sight, the correspondent for Le Monde wrote, is the black soldier with his left fist clenched in defiance of a war he has never considered his own. Wallace Terry, a black American reporter for Time magazine, taped conversations with hundreds of black soldiers. He found bitterness against Army racism, disgust with the war, generally low morale. More and more cases of fragging were reported in Vietnam. Incidents where servicemen rolled fragmentation bombs under the tents of officers who were ordering them into combat, or against whom they had other grievances. The Pentagon reported 209 fraggings in Vietnam in 1970 alone. Veterans back from Vietnam formed a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War. In December 1970, hundreds of them went to Detroit to what was called the Winter Soldier investigations, to testify publicly about atrocities they had participated in or seen in Vietnam committed by Americans against Vietnamese. In April 1971, more than 1,000 of them went to Washington, D.C. to demonstrate against the war. One by one, they went up to a wire fence around the Capitol, threw over the fence the medals they had won in Vietnam, and made brief statements about the war, sometimes emotionally, sometimes in icy, bitter calm. In the summer of 1970, 28 commissioned officers of the military, including some veterans of Vietnam, saying they represented about 250 other officers, announced formation of the Concerned Officers Movement against the war. During the fierce bombings of Hanoi and Haiphong around Christmas 1972, came the first defiance of B-52 pilots who refused to fly those missions. On June 3, 1973, the New York Times reported dropouts among West Point cadets. Officials there, the reporter wrote, linked the rate to an affluent, less disciplined, skeptical, and questioning generation, and to the anti-military mood that a small radical minority in the Vietnam War had created. But most of the anti-war action came from ordinary GIs, and most of these came from lower income groups: white, black, Native American, Chinese, and Chicano. Chicanos back home were demonstrating by the thousands against the war. A 20-year-old New York City Chinese American named Sam Choi, enlisted at 17 in the Army, was sent to Vietnam, was made a cook, and found himself the target of abuse by fellow GIs who called him chink and gook, the term for the Vietnamese, and said he looked like the enemy. One day he took a rifle and fired warning shots at his tormentors. By this time I was near the perimeter of the base and was thinking of joining the Viet Cong. At least they would trust me. Choi was taken by military police, beaten, court-martialed, sentenced to 18 months of hard labor at Fort Leavenworth. They beat me up every day like a time clock. He ended his interview with a New York Chinatown newspaper saying, "One thing, I want to tell all the Chinese kids that the Army made me sick. They made me so sick that I can't stand it." A dispatch from Phu Bai in April 1972 said that 50 GIs out of 142 men in the company refused to go on patrol, crying, "This isn't our war." The New York Times on July 14, 1973, reported that American prisoners of war in Vietnam, ordered by officers in the POW camp to stop cooperating with the enemy, shouted back, "Who's the enemy?" They formed a peace committee in the camp, and a sergeant on the committee later recalled his march from capture to the POW camp. Until we got to the first camp, we didn't see a village intact. They were all destroyed. I sat down and put myself in the middle and asked myself, is this right or wrong? Is it right to destroy villages? Is it right to kill people en masse? After a while, it just got to me. Pentagon officials in Washington and Navy spokesmen in San Diego announced after the United States withdrew its troops from Vietnam in 1973 that the Navy was going to purge itself of undesirables, and that these included as many as 6,000 men in the Pacific Fleet, a substantial proportion of them black. Altogether, about 700,000 GIs had received less than honorable discharges. In the year 1973, 1 of every 5 discharges was less than honorable, indicating something less than dutiful obedience to the military. By 1971, 177 of every 1,000 American soldiers were listed as absent without leave, some of them 3 or 4 times. Deserters doubled from 47,000 in 1967 to 89,000 in 1971. One of those who stayed, fought, but then turned against the war was Ron Kovic. His father worked in a supermarket on Long Island. In 1963, at the age of 17, he enlisted in the Marines. 2 years later, in Vietnam, at the age of 19, his spine was shattered by shell fire. Paralyzed from the waist down, he was put in a wheelchair. Back in the States, he observed the brutal treatment of wounded veterans in the veterans' hospitals, thought more and more about the war, and joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. He went to demonstrations to speak against the war. One evening, he heard actor Donald Sutherland read from the post-World War I novel by Dalton Trumbo, Johnny Got His Gun, about a soldier whose limbs and face were shot away by gunfire, a thinking torso who invented a way of communicating with the outside world and then beat out a message so powerful it could not be heard without trembling. Sutherland began to read the passage, and something I will never forget swept over me. It was as if someone was speaking for everything I ever went through in the hospital. I began to shake, and I remember there were tears in my eyes. Kovic demonstrated against the war and was arrested. He tells his story in Born on the 4th of July. They helped me back into the chair and take me to another part of the prison building to be booked. "What's your name?" the officer behind the desk says. "Ron Kovic," I say. "Occupation, Vietnam veteran against the war." "What?" he says sarcastically, looking down at me. "I'm a Vietnam veteran against the war," I almost shout back. "You should have died over there," he says. He turns to his assistant. "I'd like to take this guy out and throw him off the roof." They fingerprint me and take my picture and put me in a cell. I have begun to wet my pants like a little baby. The tube has slipped out during my examination by the doctor. I try to fall asleep, but even though I am exhausted, the anger is alive in me like a huge hot stone in my chest. I lean my head up against the wall and listen to the toilets flush again and again. Kovic and the other veterans drove to Miami to the Republican National Convention in 1972, went into the convention hall, wheeled themselves down the aisles, and as Nixon began his acceptance speech, shouted, "Stop the bombing, stop the war." Delegates cursed them, traitor, and Secret Service men hustled them out of the hall. In the fall of 1973, with no victory in sight and North Vietnamese troops entrenched in various parts of the South, the United States agreed to accept a settlement that would withdraw American troops and leave the revolutionary troops where they were until a new elected government would be set up, including communist and non-communist elements. But the Saigon government refused to agree, and the United States decided to make one final attempt to bludgeon the North Vietnamese into submission. It sent waves of B-52s over Hanoi and Haiphong, destroying homes and hospitals, killing unknown numbers of civilians. The attack did not work. Many of the B-52s were shot down. There was angry protest all over the world, and Kissinger went back to Paris and signed very much the same peace agreement that had been agreed on before. The United States withdrew its forces, continuing to give aid to the Saigon government. But when the North Vietnamese launched attacks in early 1975 against the major cities in South Vietnam, the government collapsed. In late April 1975, North Vietnamese troops entered Saigon. The American embassy staff fled, along with many Vietnamese who feared communist rule, and the long war in Vietnam was over. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and both parts of Vietnam were unified as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Traditional history portrays the end of wars as coming with the initiatives of leaders, negotiations in Paris or Brussels or Geneva or Versailles, just as it often finds the coming of war a response to the demand of the people. The Vietnam War gave clear evidence that at least for that war, making one wonder about the others, the political leaders were the last to take steps to end the war. The people were far ahead. The president was always far behind. The Supreme Court silently turned away from cases challenging the constitutionality of the war. Congress was years behind public opinion. In the spring of 1971, syndicated columnists Roland Evans and Robert Novak, two firm supporters of the war, wrote regretfully of a sudden outbreak of anti-war emotionalism in the House of Representatives and said, The anti-war animosities, now suddenly so pervasive among House Democrats, are viewed by administration backers as less anti-Nixon than as a response to constituent pressures. It was only after the intervention in Cambodia ended, and only after the nationwide campus uproar over that invasion, that Congress passed a resolution declaring that American troops should not be sent into Cambodia without its approval. And it was not until late 1973, when American troops had finally been removed from Vietnam, that Congress passed a bill limiting the power of the president to make war without congressional consent. Even there, in that War Powers Resolution, the president could make war for 60 days on his own without a congressional declaration. The administration tried to persuade the American people that the war was ending because of its decision to negotiate a peace, not because it was losing the war, not because of the powerful anti-war movement in the United States. But the government's own secret memoranda all through the war testified to its sensitivity at each stage about public opinion in the United States and abroad. The data is in the Pentagon Papers. In June of 1964, top American military and State Department officials, including Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, met in Honolulu. Rusk stated that public opinion on our SEA policy was badly divided and that therefore the president needed an affirmation of support. DM had been replaced by a general named Khan. The Pentagon historians write, upon his return to Saigon on June 5th, Ambassador Lodge went straight from the airport to call on General Khan. The main thrust of his talk with Khan was to hint that the United States government would, in the immediate future, be preparing U.S. public opinion for actions against North Vietnam. 2 months later came the Gulf of Tonkin affair. On April 2, 1965, a memo from CIA Director John McCone suggested that the bombing of North Vietnam be increased because it was not sufficiently severe to change North Vietnam's policy. On the other hand, we can expect increasing pressure to stop the bombing from various elements of the American public, from the press, the United Nations, and world opinion. The U.S. should try for a fast knockout before this opinion could build up, McCone said. Assistant Secretary of Defense John McNaughton's memo of early 1966 suggested destruction of locks and dams to create mass starvation because strikes at population targets would create a counterproductive wave of revulsion abroad and at home. In May 1967, the Pentagon historians write, McNaughton was also very deeply concerned about the breadth and intensity of public unrest and dissatisfaction with the war, especially with young people, the underprivileged, the intelligentsia, and the women. McNaughton worried, will the move to call up 20,000 reserves polarize opinion to the extent that the doves in the United States will get out of hand, massive refusals to serve, or to fight, or to cooperate, or worse? He warned, there may be a limit beyond which many Americans and much of the world will not permit the United States to go. The picture of the world's greatest superpower killing or seriously injuring 1,000 non-combatants a week while trying to pound a tiny backward nation into submission on an issue whose merits are hotly disputed is not a pretty one. It could conceivably produce a costly distortion in the American national consciousness. That costly distortion seems to have taken place by the spring of 1968, when, with the sudden and scary Tet Offensive of the National Liberation Front, Westmoreland asked President Johnson to send him 200,000 more troops, on top of the 525,000 already there. Johnson asked a small group of action officers in the Pentagon to advise him on this. They studied the situation and concluded that 200,000 troops would totally Americanize the war and would not strengthen the Saigon government, because the Saigon leadership shows no signs of a willingness, let alone an ability, to attract the necessary loyalty or support of the people. Furthermore, the report said, sending troops would mean mobilizing reserves, increasing the military budget. There would be more U.S. casualties, more taxes. And this growing disaffection accompanied, as it certainly will be, by increased defiance of the draft and growing unrest in the cities because of the belief that we are neglecting domestic problems, runs great risks of provoking a domestic crisis of unprecedented proportions. The growing unrest in the cities must have been a reference to the black uprisings that had taken place in 1967, and showed the link, whether blacks deliberately made it or not, between the war abroad and poverty at home. The evidence from the Pentagon Papers is clear, that Johnson's decision in the spring of 1968 to turn down Westmoreland's request, to slow down for the first time the escalation of the war, to diminish the bombing, to go to the conference table, was influenced to a great extent by the actions Americans had taken in demonstrating their opposition to the war. When Nixon took office, he too tried to persuade the public that protests would not affect him, but he almost went berserk when one lone pacifist picketed the White House. The frenzy of Nixon's actions against dissidents, plans for burglaries, wiretapping, mail openings, suggests the importance of the anti-war movement in the minds of national leaders. One sign that the ideas of the anti-war movement had taken hold in the American public was that juries became more reluctant to convict anti-war protesters, and local judges too were treating them differently. In Washington by 1971, judges were dismissing charges against demonstrators in cases where 2 years before they almost certainly would have been sent to jail. The anti-war groups who had raided draft boards, the Baltimore Four, the Catonsville Nine, the Milwaukee 14, the Boston Five, and more, were receiving lighter sentences for the same crimes. The last group of draft board raiders, the Camden 28, were priests, nuns, and lay people who raided a draft board in Camden, New Jersey in August 1971. It was essentially what the Baltimore Four had done 4 years earlier, when all were convicted and Phil Berrigan got 6 years in prison. But in this instance, the Camden defendants were acquitted by the jury on all counts. When the verdict was in, one of the jurors, a 53-year-old black taxi driver from Atlantic City named Samuel Braithwaite, who had spent 11 years in the Army, left a letter for the defendants. To you, the clerical physicians with your God-given talents, I say, well done. Well done for trying to heal the sick, irresponsible men who were chosen by the people to govern and lead them. These men who failed the people by raining death and destruction on a hapless country. You went out to do your part while your brothers remained in their ivory towers watching. And hopefully, someday in the near future, peace and harmony may reign to people of all nations. That was in May of 1973. The American troops were leaving Vietnam. C.L. Sulzberger, the New York Times correspondent, a man close to the government, wrote, "The U.S. emerges as the big loser, and history books must admit this. We lost the war in the Mississippi Valley, not the Mekong Valley. Successive American governments were never able to muster the necessary mass support at home." In fact, the United States had lost the war in both the Mekong Valley and the Mississippi Valley. It was the first clear defeat to the global American empire formed after World War II. It was administered by revolutionary peasants abroad and by an astonishing movement of protest at home. Back on September 26, 1969, President Richard Nixon, noting the growing anti-war activity all over the country, announced that under no circumstance will I be affected whatever by it. But 9 years later, in his memoirs, he admitted that the anti-war movement caused him to drop plans for an intensification of the war. Although publicly I continued to ignore the raging anti-war controversy, I knew, however, that after all the protests and the moratorium, American public opinion would be seriously divided by any military escalation of the war. It was a rare presidential admission of the power of public protest. From a long-range viewpoint, something perhaps even more important had happened. The rebellion at home was spreading beyond the issue of war in Vietnam. Chapter 19, Surprises. Helen Keller had said in 1911, "We vote, What does that mean? And Emma Goldman around the same time. Our modern fetish is universal suffrage. After 1920, women were voting as men did, and their subordinate condition had hardly changed. Right after women got the vote, the measure of their social progress can be seen in an advice column written by Dorothy Dix that appeared in newspapers all over the country. The woman should not merely be a domestic drudge, she said. A man's wife is the show window where he exhibits the measure of his achievement. The biggest deals are put across over luncheon tables. We meet at dinner the people who can push our fortunes. The woman who cultivates a circle of worthwhile people, who belongs to clubs, who makes herself interesting and agreeable, is a help to her husband. Robert and Helen Lind, studying Muncie, Indiana, Middletown, in the late 20s, noted the importance of good looks and dress in the assessment of women. Also, they found that when men spoke frankly among themselves, they were likely to speak of women as creatures purer and morally better than men, but as relatively impractical, emotional, unstable, given to prejudice, easily hurt, and largely incapable of facing facts or doing hard thinking. A writer in early 1930, boosting the beauty business, started off a magazine article with the sentence, "The average American woman has 16 square feet of skin." He went on to say that there were 40,000 beauty shops in the country and that $2 billion was spent each year on cosmetics for women. But this was insufficient. American women are not yet spending even 1/5 of the amount necessary to improve their appearance. He then gave an itemized list of the annual beauty needs of every woman: 12 hot oil treatments, 52 facials, 26 eyebrow plucks, etc. It seems that women have best been able to make their first escape from the prison of wifeliness, motherhood, femininity, housework, beautification, isolation, when their services have been desperately needed, whether in industry or in war or in social movements. Each time, practicality pulled the woman out of her prison in a kind of work parole program. The attempt was made to push her back once the need was over, and this led to women's struggle for change. World War II had brought more women than ever before out of the home into work. By 1960, 36% of all women 16 and older, 23 million women, worked for paid wages. But although 43% of women with school-aged children worked, there were nursery schools for only 2%. The rest had to work things out themselves. Women were 50% of the voters, but even by 1967, they held 4% of the state legislative seats and 2% of the judgeships. The median income of the working woman was about 1/3 that of the man, and attitudes towards women did not seem to have changed much since the 20s. There is no overt anti-feminism in our society in 1964, wrote feminist and sociologist Alice Rossi. Not because sex equality has been achieved, but because there is practically no feminist spark left among American women. In the civil rights movement of the 60s, the signs of a collective stirring began to appear. Women took the place they customarily took in social movements, in the front lines, as privates, not generals. In the office of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Atlanta, a Spelman College student named Ruby Doris Smith, who had been jailed during the sit-ins, expressed her anger at the way women were relegated to the routine office work, and she was joined in her protest by 2 white women in SNCC, Sandra Hayden and Mary King. The men in SNCC listened to them respectfully, read the position paper they had put together, asserting their rights, but did not do very much. Ella Baker, a veteran fighter from Harlem, now organizing in the South, knew the pattern. "I knew from the beginning that as a woman, an older woman in a group of ministers who are accustomed to having women largely as supporters, there was no place for me to have come into a leadership role." Nevertheless, women played a crucial role in those early dangerous years of organizing in the South, and were looked on with admiration. Many of these were older women like Ella Baker and Amelia Boynton in Selma, Alabama, and Mama Dolly in Albany, Georgia. Younger women, Gloria Richardson in Maryland, Annelle Ponder in Mississippi, were not only active, but leaders. Women of all ages demonstrated, went to jail. Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, a sharecropper in Ruleville, Mississippi, became legendary as organizer and speaker. She sang hymns. She walked picket lines with her familiar limp. As a child, she contracted polio. She roused people to excitement at mass meetings. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Around the same time, white, middle-class professional women were beginning to speak up. A pioneering early book, strong and influential, was Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Just what was the problem that has no name? What were the words women used when they tried to express it? Sometimes a woman would say, I feel empty somehow, incomplete. Or she would say, I feel as if I don't exist. Sometimes a tired feeling. I get so angry with the children, it scares me. I feel like crying without any reason. Friedan wrote out of her experience as a middle-class housewife. But what she spoke about touched something inside all women. The problem lay buried, unspoken, for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone. As she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night, she was afraid to ask of herself the silent question, is this all? But on an April morning in 1959, I heard a mother of four having coffee with four other mothers in a suburban development 15 miles from New York say in a tone of quiet desperation, the problem. And the others knew without words that she was not talking about a problem with her husband or her children or her home. Suddenly they realized they all shared the same problem, the problem that has no name. They began, hesitantly, to talk about it. Later, after they had picked up their children at nursery school and taken them home to nap, two of the women cried in sheer relief just to know they were not alone. The mystique that Friedan spoke of was the image of the woman as mother, as wife, living through her husband, through her children, giving up her own dreams for that. She concluded, the only way for a woman, as for a man, to find herself, to know herself as a person, is by creative work of her own. In the summer of 1964 in Macomb, Mississippi, at a Freedom House, a civil rights headquarters where people worked and lived together, the women went on strike against the men who wanted them to cook and make beds, while the men went around in cars organizing. The stirring that Friedan spoke of was true of women everywhere, it seemed. By 1969, women were 40% of the entire labor force of the United States, but a substantial number of these were secretaries, cleaning women, elementary school teachers, saleswomen, waitresses, and nurses. 1 out of every 3 working women had a husband earning less than $5,000 a year. What of the women who didn't have jobs? They worked very hard at home, but this wasn't looked on as work because in a capitalist society, or perhaps in any modern society where things and people are bought and sold for money, if work is not paid for, not given a money value, it is considered valueless. Women began to think more about this fact in the early 1960s, and Margaret Benston wrote about it, The Political Economy of Women's Liberation. Women doing housework were people outside the modern economic system. Therefore, they were like serfs or peasants, she said. The women who worked in the typical woman's job, secretary, receptionist, typist, salesperson, cleaning woman, nurse, were treated to the full range of humiliations that men in subordinate positions faced at work, plus another set of humiliations stemming from being a woman, jibes at their mental processes, sexual jokes and aggression, invisibility except as sexual objects, cold demands for more efficiency. A commercial guide to clerical time standards printed a question and answer column. Question: I'm a businessman and my secretary seems to move entirely too slowly. How many times a minute should she be able to open and close a file drawer? Answer: exactly 25 times. Times for other open and close operations are 0.04 minutes for opening or closing a folder, and 0.026 minutes for opening a standard center desk drawer. If you're worried about her chair activity, clock her against these standards. Got up from chair, 0.033 minutes. Turn in swivel chair, 0.009 minutes. A woman factory worker in New Bedford, Massachusetts, in the early 70s, in a medium-sized corporation, whose president's dividends from the corporation in 1970 amounted to $325,000, wrote in an organizing newspaper that 9% of the workers in her department were women, but all the supervisors were men. A few years ago, I was suspended for 3 days from work because my children were still young, and I had to take time off when they were sick. They want people who keep quiet, squeal on one another, and are very good little robots. The fact that many have to take nerve pills before starting their day, and a week doesn't go by that there aren't 2 or 3 people who break down and cry, doesn't mean a thing to them. She added, but times are changing, and from now on, more people will speak out and demand their so-called bosses that they be treated the way the bosses themselves would like to be treated. Times indeed were changing. Around 1967, women in the various movements, civil rights, Students for a Democratic Society, anti-war groups, began meeting as women, and in early 1968, at a women's anti-war meeting in Washington, hundreds of women carrying torches paraded to the Arlington National Cemetery and staged the burial of traditional womanhood. At this point, and later too, there was some disagreement among women, and even more among men, on whether women should battle on specifically women's issues, or just take part in general movements against racism, war, capitalism. But the idea of a feminist focus grew. In the fall of 1968, a group called Radical Women attracted national attention when they protested the selection of Miss America, which they called an image that oppresses women. They all threw bras, girdles, curlers, false eyelashes, wigs, and other things they called women's garbage into a freedom trash can. A sheep was crowned Miss America. More important, people were beginning to speak of women's liberation. Some of the New York radical women shortly afterward formed WITCH, Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, and its members, dressed as witches, appeared suddenly on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. A leaflet put out by WITCH in New York said, "Witch lives and laughs in every woman. She is the free part of each of us. Beneath the shy smiles, the acquiescence to absurd male domination, the makeup or flesh-suffocating clothes our sick society demands. There is no joining witch. If you are a woman and dare to look within yourself, you are a witch. You make your own rules." WITCH in Washington, D.C. protested at the United Fruit Company for the corporation's activities in the Third World and its treatment of its women office workers. In Chicago, it protested the firing of a radical feminist teacher named Marlene Dixon. Poor women, black women, expressed the universal problem of women in their own way. In 1964, Robert Coles, Children of Crisis, interviewed a black woman from the South recently moved to Boston, who spoke of the desperation of her life, the difficulty of finding happiness. "To me, having a baby inside me is the only time I'm really alive," without talking specifically about their neighborhood people to fight injustices, to get needed services. In the mid-19th Lerner, Black Women in White America, about it. "I organized this neighborhood organization. 2 men and 6 ladies started it. That was a hard pull. A lot of people joined in later. For about 5 months, we had meetings pretty near every night. We learned how to work with other people. A lot of people were afraid to really do anything. You were afraid to go to the city hall or ask for anything. You didn't even ask the landlord for anything. You were afraid of him. Then we had meetings, and then we weren't afraid so much anymore. The way we got this playground, we blocked off the street, wouldn't let anything come through. We wouldn't let the trolley bus come through. The whole neighborhood was in it. Took record players and danced. It went on for a week. We didn't get arrested. There was too many of us. So then the city put up this playground for the kids. A woman named Patricia Robinson wrote a pamphlet called Poor Black Woman, in which she connected the problems of women with the need for basic social change. Rebellion by poor black women, bottom of a class hierarchy heretofore not discussed, places the question of what kind of society will the poor black woman demand and struggle for. Already she demands the right to have birth control, like middle-class black and white women. She is aware that it takes two to oppress, and that she and other poor people no longer are submitting to oppression, in this case, genocide. She allies herself with the have-nots in the wider world and their revolutionary struggles. She had been forced by historical conditions to withdraw the children from male dominance and to educate and support them herself. In this very process, male authority and exploitation are seriously weakened. Further, she realizes that the children will be used as all poor children have been used through history, as poorly paid mercenaries fighting to keep or put an elite group in power. Through these steps, she has begun to question aggressive male domination and the class society which enforces it, capitalism. In 1970, Dorothy Bolden, a laundry worker in Atlanta and mother of 6, told why in 1968 she began organizing women doing housework into the National Domestic Workers Union. She said, "I think women should have a voice in making decisions in their community for betterment. Because this woman in the slum is scuffling hard, and she's got a very good, intelligent mind to do things, and she's been overlooked for so many years. I think she should have a voice." Women tennis players organized. A woman fought to be a jockey, won her case, became the first woman jockey. Women artists picketed the Whitney Museum, charging sex discrimination in a sculptor show. Women journalists picketed the Gridiron Club in Washington, which excluded women. By the start of 1974, women's studies programs existed at 78 institutions, and about 2,000 courses on women were being offered at about 500 campuses. Women's magazines and newspapers began appearing, locally and nationally, and books on women's history and the movement came out in such numbers that some bookstores had special sections for them. The very jokes on television, some sympathetic, some caustic, showed how national was the effect of the movement. Certain television commercials, which women felt humiliated them, were eliminated after protest. In 1967, after lobbying by women's groups, President Johnson signed an executive order banning sex discrimination in federally connected employment. And in the years that followed, women's groups demanded that this be enforced. Over 1,000 suits were initiated by NOW, National Organization for Women, formed in 1966, against U.S. corporations charging sex discrimination. The right to abortion became a major issue. Before 1970, about 1 million abortions were done every year, of which only about 10,000 were legal. Perhaps a third of the women having illegal abortions, mostly poor people, had to be hospitalized for complications. How many thousands died as a result of these illegal abortions? No one really knows. But the illegalization of abortion clearly worked against the poor, for the rich could manage either to have their baby or to have their abortion under safe conditions. Court actions to do away with the laws against abortions were begun in over 20 states between 1968 and 1970, and public opinion grew stronger for the right of women to decide for themselves without government interference. In the book, Sisterhood is Powerful, an important collection of women's writing around 1970, an article by Lucinda Sisler, Unfinished Business, Birth Control, said that abortion is a woman's right. No one can veto her decision and compel her to bear a child against her will. In the spring of 1969, a Harris poll showed that 64% of those polled thought the decision on abortion was a private matter. Finally, in early 1973, the Supreme Court decided, Roe v. Wade, Doe v. Bolton, that the state could prohibit abortions only in the last 3 months of pregnancy, that it could regulate abortion for health purposes during the second 3 months of pregnancy. And during the first 3 months, a woman and her doctor had the right to decide. There was a push for child care centers, and although women did not succeed in getting much help from government, thousands of cooperative child care centers were set up. Women also began to speak openly, for the first time, about the problem of rape. Each year, 50,000 rapes were reported, and many more were unreported. Women began taking self-defense courses. There were protests against the way police treated women, interrogated them, insulted them when women filed rape charges. A book by Susan Brownmiller, Against Our Will, was widely read. It is a powerful, indignant history and analysis of rape, suggesting self-defense, individual or collective. Fighting back on a multiplicity of levels, that is the activity we must engage in together if we, women, are to redress the imbalance and rid ourselves and men of the ideology of rape. Rape can be eradicated, not merely controlled or avoided on an individual basis, but the approach must be long-range and cooperative, and must have the understanding and goodwill of many men as well as women. Many women were active in trying to get a constitutional amendment, ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, passed by enough states. But it seemed clear that even if it became law, it would not be enough, that what women had accomplished had come through organization, action, protest. Even where the law was helpful, it was helpful only if backed by action. Shirley Chisholm, a black congresswoman, said, "The law cannot do it for us. We must do it for ourselves. Women in this country must become revolutionaries. We must refuse to accept the traditional roles and stereotypes. We must replace the old negative thoughts about our femininity with positive thoughts and positive action." Perhaps the most profound effect of the women's movement of the 60s, beyond the actual victories on abortion in job equality, was called consciousness raising, often done in women's groups, which met in homes all across the country. This meant the rethinking of roles, the rejection of inferiority, the confidence in self, a bond of sisterhood, a new solidarity of mother and daughter. The Atlanta poet Esta Seton wrote her life. This is the picture that keeps forming in my mind. My young mother, barely 17, cooking their kosher dinner on the coal stove, that first winter in Vermont. And my father, mute in his feelings, except when he shouted, eating to show his love. 50 years later, her blue eyes would grow cold with the shock of that gray house, and the babies one after another, and the doctor who said, "If you don't want any more children, move out of the house." For the first time, the sheer biological uniqueness of women was openly discussed. Some theorists, Shulamit Firestone in The Dialectics of Sex, for instance, thought this was more fundamental to their oppression than any particular economic system. It was liberating to talk frankly about what had for so long been secret, hidden, cause for shame and embarrassment: menstruation, masturbation, menopause, abortion, lesbianism. One of the most influential books to appear in the early 70s was a book assembled by 11 women in the Boston Women's Health Book Collective called Our Bodies Ourselves. It contained an enormous amount of practical information on women's anatomy, on sexuality and sexual relationships, on lesbianism, on nutrition and health, on rape, self-defense, venereal disease, birth control, abortion, pregnancy, childbirth, and menopause. More important even than the information, the charts, the photos, the candid exploration of the previously unmentioned, was the mood of exuberance throughout the book, the enjoyment of the body, the happiness with the newfound understanding, the new sisterhood with young women, middle-aged women, older women. They quoted the English suffragette Christabel Pankhurst. "Remember the dignity of your womanhood. Do not appeal, do not beg, do not grovel. Take courage, join hands, stand beside us, fight with us. The fight began, many women were saying, with the body, which seemed to be the beginning of the exploitation of women, as sex plaything, weak and incompetent, as pregnant woman, helpless, as middle-aged woman, no longer considered beautiful, as older woman, to be ignored, set aside. A biological prison had been created by men and society. As Adrienne Rich said, of Woman Born, women are controlled by lashing us to our bodies, she wrote. I have a very clear, keen memory of myself the day after I was married. I was sweeping a floor. Probably the floor did not really need to be swept. Probably I simply did not know what else to do with myself. But as I swept that floor, I thought, now I am a woman. This is an age-old action. This is what women have always done. I felt I was bending to some ancient form, too ancient to question. This is what women have always done. As soon as I was visibly and clearly pregnant, I felt for the first time in my adolescent and adult life not guilty. The atmosphere of approval in which I was bathed, even by strangers on the street, it seemed, was like an aura I carried with me, in which doubts, fears, misgivings met with absolute denial. This is what women have always done. Rich said women could use the body as a resource rather than a destiny. Patriarchal systems, she said, whether under capitalism or socialism, limited women's bodies to their own needs. She discussed the training of passivity in women. Generations of schoolgirls were raised on Little Women, where Jo is told by her mother, I am angry nearly every day of my life, Jo, but I have learned not to show it, and I still hope to learn not to feel it, though it may take me another 40 years to do so. Male doctors used instruments to bring out children, replacing the sensitive hands of midwives in the era of anesthetized, technologized childbirth. Rich disagreed with her fellow feminist Firestone, who wanted to change the biological inevitability of childbirth because it is painful and a source of subordination. She wanted, under different social conditions, to make childbirth a source of physical and emotional joy. One could not talk of Freud's ignorance of women, Rich said, as his one blind spot, which implied that in other matters his vision was clear. Such ignorance distorts all. There is a dilemma of the body. I know no woman, virgin, mother, lesbian, married, celibate, whether she earns her keep as a housewife or cocktail waitress or scanner of brain waves, for whom her body is not a fundamental problem. Its clouded meaning, its fertility, its desire, its so-called frigidity, its bloody speech, its silences, its changes and mutilations, its rapes and ripenings. Her reply to this, the repossession of our bodies, a world in which every woman is the presiding genius of her own body, as a basis for bringing forth not just children, but new visions, new meanings, a new world. For most women who were not intellectuals, the question was even more immediate: how to eliminate hunger, suffering, subordination, humiliation in the here and now. A woman named Johnny Tillman wrote in 1972, I'm a woman. I'm a black woman. I'm a poor woman. I'm a fat woman. I'm a middle-aged woman, and I'm on welfare. I have raised 6 children. I grew up in Arkansas, worked there for 15 years in a laundry, moved to California. In 1963, I got too sick to work anymore. Friends helped me to go on welfare. Welfare is like a traffic accident. It can happen to anybody, but especially it happens to women. And that is why welfare is a women's issue. For a lot of middle-class women in this country, women's liberation is a matter of concern. For women on welfare, it's a matter of survival. Welfare, she said, was like a super sexist marriage. You trade in a man for the man. The man runs everything, controls your money. She and other welfare mothers organized a national welfare rights organization. They urged that women be paid for their work, housekeeping, child rearing. No woman can be liberated until all women get off their knees. In the problem of women was the germ of a solution, not only for their oppression, but for everybody's. The control of women in society was ingeniously effected. It was not done directly by the state. Instead, the family was used, men to control women, women to control children, all to be preoccupied with one another, to turn to one another for help, to blame one another for trouble, to do violence to one another when things weren't going right. Why could this not be turned around? Could women liberating themselves, children freeing themselves, men and women beginning to understand one another, find the source of their common oppression outside rather than in one another? Perhaps then they could create nuggets of strength in their own relationships, millions of pockets of insurrection. They could revolutionize thought and behavior in exactly that seclusion of family privacy which the system had counted on to do its work of control and indoctrination. And together, instead of at odds, male, female, parents, children, they could undertake the changing of society itself. It was a time of uprisings. If there could be rebellion inside that most subtle and complex of prisons, the family, it was reasonable that there be rebellions in the most brutal and obvious of prisons, the penitentiary system itself. In the 60s and early 70s, those rebellions multiplied. They also took on an unprecedented political character and the ferocity of class war, coming to a climax at Attica, New York, in September of 1971. The prison had arisen in the United States as an attempt at Quaker reform to replace mutilation, hanging, exile, the traditional punishments during colonial times. The prison was intended, through isolation, to produce repentance and salvation. But prisoners went insane and died in that isolation. By mid-19th century, the prison was based on hard labor, along with various punishments, sweat boxes, iron yokes, solitary. The approach was summed up by the warden at the Ossining, New York Penitentiary. In order to reform a criminal, you must first break his spirit. That approach persisted. Prison officials would convene annually to congratulate themselves on the progress being made. The president of the American Correctional Association, delivering the annual address in 1966, described the new edition of the Manual of Correctional Standards. It permits us to linger, if we will, at the gates of correctional Valhalla, with an abiding pride in the sense of a job superbly done. We may be proud, we may be satisfied, we may be content. He said this just after, in the midst of, and just before, the most intense series of prison uprisings the country had ever seen. There had always been prison riots. A wave of them in the 1920s ended with a riot at Clinton, New York, a prison of 1,600 inmates, which was suppressed with 3 prisoners killed. Between 1950 and 1953, more than 50 major riots occurred in American prisons. In the early 1960s, prisoners on a work gang in Georgia, smashing rocks, used the same sledgehammers to break their legs to call attention to their situation of daily brutality. At San Quentin Prison in California, which housed 4,000 prisoners, there was a series of revolts in the late 60s, a race riot in 1967, a united black-white general strike in early 1968 that shut down almost all the prison industries, and then a second strike that summer. At the Queen's House of Detention on Long Island in New York in the fall of 1970, prisoners took over the jail, took hostages, issued demands. The prisoners' negotiating committee included 4 blacks, 1 Puerto Rican, 1 white. They demanded immediate bail hearings on 47 cases that they said were examples of racism in the granting of bail. Judges came inside the prison, granted some paroles and reductions, and the hostages were released. But when the prisoners continued to hold out, police stormed the jail with tear gas and clubs, and the revolt was over. Around the same time, in November 1970, in Folsom Prison in California, a work stoppage began which became the longest prison strike in the history of the United States. Most of the 2,400 prisoners held out in their cells for 19 days without food, in the face of threats and intimidation. The strike was broken with a combination of force and deception, and 4 of the prisoners were sent on a 14-hour ride to another prison, shackled and naked on the floor of a van. One of the rebels wrote, "The spirit of awareness has grown. The seed has been planted." The prisons in the United States had long been an extreme reflection of the American system itself. The stark life differences between rich and poor, the racism, the use of victims against one another, the lack of resources of the underclass to speak out, the endless reforms that change little. Dostoevsky once said, "The degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons." It had long been true, and prisoners knew this better than anyone, that the poorer you were, the more likely you were to end up in jail. This was not just because the poor committed more crimes. In fact, they did. The rich did not have to commit crimes to get what they wanted. The laws were on their side. But when the rich did commit crimes, they often were not prosecuted, and if they were, they could get out on bail, hire clever lawyers, get better treatment from judges. Somehow, the jails ended up full of poor black people. In 1969, there were 502 convictions for tax fraud. Such cases, called white-collar crimes, usually involve people with a good deal of money. Of those convicted, 20% ended up in jail. The fraud averaged $190,000 per case. Their sentences averaged 7 months. That same year, for burglary and auto theft, crimes of the poor, 60% ended up in prison. The auto thefts averaged $992. The sentences averaged 18 months. The burglaries averaged $321. The sentences averaged 33 months. Willard Galen, a psychiatrist, relates partial justice, a case which, with changes in details, could be multiplied thousands of times. He had just interviewed 17 Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to register for the draft during the Vietnam War, and all had received 2-year sentences. He came to a young black man who had notified his draft board he could not, in conscience, cooperate with the draft because he was repelled by the violence of the Vietnam War. He received a 5-year sentence. Galen writes, "Hanks was the first 5-year sentence I had encountered. He was also the first black man. There were additional factors." "How was your hair then?" I asked. "Afro. And what were you wearing?" "A dashiki." "Don't you think that might have affected your sentence?" "Of course." "Was it worth a year or 2 of your life?" I asked. "That's all of my life," he said, looking at me with a combination of dismay and confusion. "Man, don't you know? That's what it's all about. Am I free to have my style? Am I free to have my hair? Am I free to have my skin?" "Of course," I said. "You're right." Galen found enormous discretion given to judges in the handing out of sentences. In Oregon, of 33 men convicted of violating the draft law, 18 were put on probation. In southern Texas, of 16 men violating the same law, none was put on probation. And in southern Mississippi, every defendant was convicted and given the maximum of 5 years. In one part of the country, New England, the average sentence for all crimes was 11 months. In another part, the South, it was 78 months. But it wasn't simply a matter of North and South. In New York City, one judge handling 673 persons brought before him for public drunkenness, all poor, the rich get drunk behind closed doors, discharged 531 of them. Another judge handling 566 persons on the same charge discharged 1 person. With such power in the hands of the courts, the poor, the black, the odd, the homosexual, the hippie, the radical are not likely to get equal treatment before judges who are almost uniformly white, upper middle class, orthodox. While in any one year, 1972 for instance, perhaps 375,000 people will be in jail, county or city, or in prisons, state or federal, and 54,000 in juvenile detention, there will also be 900,000 under probation and 300,000 on parole, a total of 1,600,000 people affected by the criminal justice system. Considering turnover, In any one year, several million people will come in and go out of this system. It is a population largely invisible to middle-class America. But if 20 million blacks could be invisible for so long, why not 4 or 5 million criminals? A study by the Children's Defense Fund, Thomas Cottle, Children in Jail, in the mid-70s, revealed that more than 900,000 young people under 18 are jailed in the course of the year. Anyone trying to describe the reality of prison falters. A man in Walpole Prison in Massachusetts wrote, "Every program that we get is used as a weapon against us. The right to go to school, to go to church, to have visitors, to write, to go to the movies. They all end up being weapons of punishment. None of the programs are ours. Everything is treated as a privilege that can be taken away from us. The result is insecurity, a frustration that keeps eating away at you." Another Walpole prisoner, "I haven't eaten in the mess hall for 4 years. I just couldn't take it anymore. You'd go into the serving line in the morning and 100 or 200 cockroaches would go running away from the trays. The trays were grimy and the food was raw or had dirt or maggots in it. Many a night I'd go hungry, living on peanut butter and sandwiches, getting a loaf of bread here or a hunk of bologna there. Other guys couldn't do that because they didn't have my connections or they didn't have money for the canteen." Communication with the outside world was difficult. Guards would tear up letters. Others would be intercepted and read. Jerry Souza, a prisoner at Walpole in 1970, sent 2 letters, one to a judge, the other to the parole board, to tell about a beating by guards. They went unanswered. 8 years later, at a court hearing, he discovered the prison authorities had intercepted them, never sent them out. The families suffered with the prisoner. "During the last lockup, my 4-year-old son sneaked off into the yard and picked me a flower. A guard in the tower called the warden's office, and a deputy came in with the state police at his side. He announced that if any child went into the yard and picked another flower, all visits would be terminated." The prison rebellions of the late 60s and early 70s had a distinctly different character than the earlier ones. The prisoners in the Queen's House of Detention referred to themselves as revolutionaries. All over the country, prisoners were obviously affected by the turmoil in the country, the Black Revolt, the youth upsurge, the anti-war movement. The events of those years underlined what prisoners already sensed, that whatever crimes they had committed, the greatest crimes were being committed by the authorities who maintained the prisons, by the government of the United States. The law was being broken daily by the president, sending bombers to kill, sending men to be killed, outside the Constitution, outside the highest law of the land. State and local officials were violating the civil rights of black people, which was against the law, and were not being prosecuted for it. Literature about the black movement, books on the war, began to seep into the prisons. The example set in the streets by blacks, by anti-war demonstrators, was exhilarating against a lawless system. Defiance was the only answer. It was a system which sentenced Martin Sostre, a 52-year-old black man running an Afro-Asian bookstore in Buffalo, New York, to 25 to 30 years in prison for allegedly selling $15 worth of heroin to an informer who later recanted his testimony. The recantation did not free Sostre. He could find no court, including the Supreme Court of the United States, to revoke the judgment. He spent 8 years in prison, was beaten 10 times by guards, spent 3 years in solitary confinement, battling and defying the authorities all the way, until his release. Such injustice deserved only rebellion. There had always been political prisoners, people sent to jail for belonging to radical movements, for opposing war. But now a new kind of political prisoner appeared. The man or woman convicted of an ordinary crime, who in prison became awakened politically. Some prisoners began making connections between their personal ordeal and the social system. They then turned not to individual rebellion, but to collective action. They became concerned, amid an environment whose brutality demanded concentration on one's own safety, an atmosphere of cruel rivalry, for the rights and safety of others. George Jackson was one of these new political prisoners. In Soledad Prison, California, on an indeterminate sentence for a $70 robbery, having already served 10 years of it, Jackson became a revolutionary. He spoke with a fury that matched his condition. This monster, the monster they've engendered in me, will return to torment its maker, from the grave, the pit, the profoundest pit. Hurl me into the next existence. The descent into hell won't turn me. I'm going to charge them reparations and blood. I'm going to charge them like a maddened, wounded, rogue male elephant, ears flared, trunk raised, trumpet blaring. War without terms. A prisoner like this would not last. And when his book, Soledad Brother, became one of the most widely read books of black militancy in the United States, by prisoners, by black people, by white people, perhaps this ensured he would not last. All my life I've done exactly what I wanted to do, just when I wanted, no more, perhaps less sometimes, but never any more, which explains why I had to be jailed. I never adjusted. I haven't adjusted even yet, with half of my life already in prison. He knew what might happen. Born to a premature death, a menial subsistence wage worker, odd job man, the cleaner, the cop, the man under hatches, without bail, that's me, the colonial victim. Anyone who can pass the civil service examination today can kill me tomorrow with complete immunity. In August 1971, he was shot in the back by guards at San Quentin prison while he was allegedly trying to escape. The state story, analyzed by Eric Mann in Comrade George, was full of holes. Prisoners in jails and state prisons all over the country knew, even before the final autopsy was in, even before later disclosures suggested a government plot to kill Jackson, that he had been murdered for daring to be a revolutionary in prison. Shortly after Jackson's death, there was a chain of rebellions around the country. In San Jose Civic Center Jail, in Dallas County Jail, in Suffolk County Jail in Boston, in Cumberland County Jail in Bridgeton, New Jersey, in Bexar County Jail